Hi everyone, my name is Cansu Aydın. I'm the chair of this session. I'm a second year student in American Culture and Studies, American Culture and Literature. The name of this session is Everyday Multiculturalism, and our first speaker is Mert Önal. Mert Önal was born in Ankara on 7th of November 1992. He graduated from Çankaya Anatolian High School in 2011, and he was admitted to Bilkent University Department of Physics in 2012. And finally this year he was admitted to Department of American Culture and Literature in Bilkent University. Now he's going to present his paper about identity and culture as an experience. So.
Thank you very much, Cansu. I will be talking about two authors today, John Dewey and Gloria Anzaldúa, in terms of how they view identity and culture as part of our daily experience. So I'll just try to... Okay. My main argument is that I will try to establish certain links between Dewey and Anzaldúa and how they actually complete and complement each other concerning identity and culture. Once we have properly situated these two concepts, I will try to identify some of the problems that we face in multicultural societies and maybe some tentative solutions. In terms of this, Dewey's vision of radical democracy and Anzaldúa's call for a new consciousness and obviously policy. Gloria Anzaldúa was born in 1942. Borderlands, the piece I will be talking about today, was published in 1987. Anzaldúa, Chicana lesbian feminist scholar. So I will try to talk about the historical context. What kind of response did Anzaldúa give to these? The issues of sexuality and gender increasingly became issues harboring intense tension after the post-war period, And for example, in the 1960s and 1970s, we see kind of sexual liberation and feminist movements. And always, as history goes, there is a backlash. And we see this backlash in the 1980s. Reagan happened. And so there is also racial tension in the 1980s. Reagan depicts the US-Mexico border as the front line, as the war zone. So these all feed into Anzaldúa's response. What is she trying to do with this piece? So the concept of mestiza, which is very salient in Anzaldúa's writing, it's about mixed racial background. Native American, Spanish, African American, these very complex and diverse set of identities form Anzaldúa's main argument. What kind of experience did she have while growing up? So I will try to put a lot of quotes to make sure that everybody gets what Anzaldúa is trying to do by her own words. So here, Anzaldúa is talking about why people have to assimilate. They don't really do it by their choice. If they don't, they face economic difficulties because although the United States made progress with civil rights movement, etc., the structural problems, the de facto segregation still stands today in the US, and it did back then. So she's trying to explain how this cultural conflict within yourself. You have to assimilate, but at the same time you want to preserve your identity, which is also quite volatile at the same time. So another quote. So this is very important for my topic because it talks about daily experience as how you perceive your own identity. She talks about music at some point. Then she says there are more subtle things that we can actually talk about. I related to this for a number of reasons. So the five senses, we can see it here: smells, noise, everything is here, imagery. But one thing especially caught my attention, homemade white cheese sizzling in a pan, melting inside the folded tortilla. Then she links this to her family, and I really related to this because in my family, around midnight, we all gather around the kitchen and start doğrama kaşar. So we all have our own brands, different versions of kaşar, and we talk about how our day went while we perform that action. So I really related to this. And Anzaldúa, this is a master's thesis, The Borderlands. She's trying to incorporate our own life story into an academic article, which is a bit uncontroversial at that time. So I will try to do a similar thing. I will try to draw from my own experiences about my identity, my vision of culture, in order to honor this radically different approach. So now we can move into Dewey because we understand that this is going to be about daily life. So Dewey experience and human action. These are the key concepts. So who is John Dewey? He's a philosopher and educator born in USA, 1859, in which On the Origin of Species was published. This is a very significant coincidence because the theory of evolution and the psychology theories of William James will influence John Dewey immensely. A whole new kind of vision when approaching things like identity and culture. Very complex, very dynamic. So the historical context for John Dewey is important because he will found a school of philosophy called pragmatism. And pragmatism is essentially a response as well, as everything is. So vast changes are happening at the turn of the 19th century, when we enter the 20th century. So he explains it in, I think, in very vivid terms. So transformations in the family, the church, the school, the science and art in political and economic relations. We saw the Gilded Age. We saw inequality increase. We saw tensions increase. We see labor movements. We see progressivism. This is a very intense period which you can spend hours on trying to understand what changed. And he says that we are baffled in the attempt to lay hold of them, although we celebrate our imagination. We are baffled. So drawing from this fact of change and how traditional classical liberalism does not solve the problems that this period brings to us. So John Dewey argued that philosophy should be an active tool. How do we live better lives? It's more like Socrates. He wants to improve the quality of the human condition. So he wants to go back. And Dewey was an immensely active person. He wrote books, a lot of books, but he was also an activist at the same time. He created the Chicago Laboratory School where his principles of education, child-centered pedagogy, and this will also reflect on the Finnish education system in the future. They will incorporate this very well, and as you know, the Finnish education system today is one of the best. So he formed unions, he worked in settlement houses, although he avoided, just like the rest of the progressive movement, the issue of race, which I will be critical in this talk. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk actually was aware of Dewey's accomplishments, and he invited him to Turkey in 1924. Dewey wrote a report on the educational system, and he saw that this revolutionary period that Turkey was going through could only last if there was cultivation of democratic values. So the Republican generation that we celebrate today, oh, we are Republicans, actually is a result of the education policy of this era. So village institutions, you might have heard of them. It's about cultivating democracy, collaboration, and vocational training at the same time. He looked and saw an agrarian society, so he said, if these children are going to go to school, they should learn how to farm. They should learn about animals. They should learn about what they're going to produce. Eventually, we lost that tradition after the 1950s. So I will try to jump back to Anzaldúa, and I will try to establish some critical links with Dewey. I'm going to talk about the self. It's a very profound philosophical topic, and I find it interesting. So Dewey says that the self is not something ready-made, but something in continuous formation through choice of action. I would like to emphasize the part of action. So Anzaldúa talks about participating in the creation of a new culture. This is kind of parallel with what Dewey is trying to do by emphasizing the agency and human action of different kind of identities and backgrounds. So they kind of both anticipate the same thing, although almost a century divides these two authors. So dualisms. I have to talk about dualisms because the most crucial part of pragmatism is about the deconstruction of dualisms. So what kind of dualisms do we see? For example, the subject-object duality. If people are familiar with philosophy, this is an epistemological problem. So the traditional philosophy sees that we have an environment and we're passively watching it and then corresponding our ideas with the reality. Nobody thinks that we can actually change our environment and the environment can change us. This is a post-Darwinian kind of framework. So there's the dualism of self and society. I am this individual that came out of the state of nature and I saw other people, let's sign a contract. So Dewey does not see it that way. He sees a constant exchange, a kind of negotiation, and usually conflict with society. And this is one of the most important things, important dualisms of traditional philosophy, means and ends. This is what constitutes the authoritarian regime's justification. As long as we have this end of equality, flourishment, all these kinds of nice words, but at the same time we have to kill a couple of million people. So Dewey challenges this dualism of means and ends, and so does Anzaldúa. Anzaldúa thinks that I'll just assimilate a little and I will try to survive, and then when I reach a certain status, I will try to fight for the Chicano community. This is not going to help. You have to start and be consistent with your methodology. So this is what unites Dewey and Anzaldúa. They challenge the dualisms and especially their focus on the process. How do you get over subordination, segregation? By acting democratically. You don't do segregation in order to overcome segregation. So the language of biology and evolution, this is important because Anzaldúa constantly uses words like cross-pollination, chromosomes, genetics, diversity, novelty. These are all concepts that we constantly see in Dewey and Anzaldúa. And why do these matter? Because they are naturalistic approaches. They don't take the abstract concepts of, we have this race and this race. It doesn't work like that for Anzaldúa and Dewey. So as I said, the vocabulary, naturally, evolution, living language, evolved out. We see this constantly through Dewey and Anzaldúa. So I'm going to try and talk about romanticization and demonization as part of our understanding of culture and identity. We have this problem, especially when we look at the United States. There is the American mind, the American character, the frontier. Well, you should ask the Native Americans about how they see this frontier movement, how they experienced it. So Dewey kind of alludes to this, but he never explicitly talks about race. And the settlement houses are not radically against segregation. They actually kind of complement it because they, gather immigrants and they try to make them into the melting pot. So I will be critical about Dewey in that way. But Dewey gives us a tool. It's a framework. So how does Dewey define his philosophical thought, pragmatism? It is a method. It is not like Marxism, where this theory of history blends it with materialism. It's not like that. Pragmatism is a method. And what does the method say? It is essentially says that if you have interested parties, you have to negotiate with them. And there will be conflict. There will be conflict, but we have the agency to determine the character of that conflict. Unfortunately, the 20th century saw a very violent kind of and hegemonical idea of negotiation. I mean, people saw themselves, okay, I'm being voluntarily American, although this does not exist, but it's purely economic. If you're going to get opportunity, you have to kind of blend in with your environment. And when you kind of read some of the stories in Britain and the United States, where in the very childhood people are not cultivating certain values the perspective we have today is exposure. Expose them to certain cultures, talk them about Chinese food, etc., and they will suddenly become tolerant. First of all, this is not an issue of tolerance. Different cultures are not something we have to tolerate. I mean, the bug on my curtain is something I might tolerate. This is not about toleration. This is about human dignity. This is about seeing someone as a human being who has a very volatile identity, very volatile culture. And he does not have to this is not about toleration. The discourse itself is very problematic. My slides are a bit fragmented, maybe because it was modernism that we studied this week. I will try to continue with what Dewey and Anzaldúa converge over. So, romanticization. So we see this in Rousseau. Oh, we had this primitive society, kind of equal, there was not so much conflict. Now we have this civil society which is where there's conflict, where there's inequality. And a lot of other philosophers like Wollstonecraft would say, no, we can actually move from this society to a new one. We don't have to stay in this part. And this might not be civil society. So I see in Anzaldúa, she talks about Aslan, the spiritual homeland of, for example, how she talks about Mexican Americans in terms of this context, how it feed into the political movement of the 1960s, labor movements, farming movements, etc. So, but she talks about Aztecs. These people actually enslaved other tribes, and they were quite patriarchal, even before Columbus came to the Americas. So we see a method here. You see what is wrong and you talk about it. Romanticization and demonization, on the other hand, does the opposite. If you're demonizing something, you just look at it, see one little flaw, and then generalize the whole thing. Romanticization is just as bad. The liberals in the United States today say, oh, the 1950s, Eisenhower, everything was good, inequality was decreasing. There was segregation, there was oppression, there was immense oppression of women, gays, lesbians, etc. This is problematic because it does not acknowledge change. So romanticizing the 1950s like most of liberals in the United States does is not going to work. And Anzaldúa and Dewey would reject that. So what do we do about it? What can we do about it as individuals who constantly interact with our society? Turkey is a vastly multicultural state, although it does not act like that. So what can we do? First of all, we have to acknowledge that conflict, clashes, friction, these are part of how we are going to view each other and ourselves. I'm in constant conflict with myself. Today my identity does not have to be constant throughout this week. And just like me, other people have the same quality. So I can't just say, oh, you're acting inconsistently with what you said, what you did last week. Well, last week a lot of things changed maybe. So we really don't know. So we have to take a deep breath before approaching. And we need to, so talking about exposure, there is two kinds of experience for Dewey. One is experience that is just random. I will expose myself to this, I will expose myself to that, I will do bungee jumping, I will taste exotic food. And then 1 week later, what happened? So that is not intelligent exposure. What is intelligent exposure? What guides further experience? So I interact someone with a different culture. I try to see how are we different, why are we different, and try to create some common experience and then move on with it. How can it continue? So, for example, when I tried poetry, I tried to go through those steps. First of all, I did the wrong thing. I exposed myself to all these kinds of anthologies, and they said, okay, I hate poetry. So, but then I followed a more specific, more intelligent method, and slowly I found poems that actually reflect me, my ideology, etc. And then now I like poetry. So we should approach culture and identity in a similar way, is what I try to argue. So without talking about assimilation, hegemony, and demonization / romanticization, we're not going to solve the crisis that I think the 21st century has shown us. Because this culture of demonization and romanticization is pervasive everywhere. So when we do this, Dewey says, you're not going to make a lot of friends, and you're not going to make healthy enemies. So what is a healthy enemy? You kind of, reinforce each other in the end, and your animosity might not turn into the violent, genocidal clashes we saw in the 20th century. So that's basically my approach to multiculturalism. I will just try to see if I jumped anything. Is there any idea of time, by the way?
We have about 30 minutes of time, half an hour.
There is another, I think, speaker. There is another speaker, right? Okay.
It's going to last for 1 hour, so actually your time is 10.
Okay, I'll just put some closing remarks then. Okay, I'll just try to see. I'm sorry about the slides. I had some problems when designing these. So I'm going to, one last thing, asking questions. When we approach concepts like identity and culture, I don't think we are asking the correct questions because they are plagued by certain dualisms. So what Dewey and Anzaldúa try to do is, let's ask better questions. For example, as I talked about United States liberalism. So we have this argument, should the government be big or should... So I can now take questions.
We can take questions before switching to the presentation. So,
when we go to demonization and romanticization and dualism, like creating binary positions in people's minds, like maybe people try to idealize, especially themselves and their surroundings and their close relatives, and they try to create exact opposite on the others. Like stereotyping, can we consider these similar things or parallel things?
Yes, the binary opposition, creating quite artificial oppositions. This is a very important concern, especially for Anzaldúa, but Dewey also talks about this as well, especially in terms of politics. So I would completely agree with that. And the problem is the world is not usually in terms of binary oppositions, and it's not always about balance of power. Although the discourse is very popular, when you just look at the IR journals, you just see balance of power all the time. But there are, I think, a lot of more things to consider. So I would agree with that. That is very important.
any other questions? So, thank you for this presentation.
Okay.